Let's talk about Nesara. What is Nasara? The National or Global Economic Security and Reformation Act. Basically, it will disband the Federal Reserve and put us back onto the gold standard, where our money is backed by gold instead of the Federal Reserve. But that's not it. Also do this. This. Ooh, abolish income tax, which is illegal, right? And this. So why has the government been trying so hard to make sure that this never sees the light of day? JFK certainly thought this was a good idea. On June 4th, 1963, signed Executive Order 11110 to issue certificates or money backed by the silver bullion or minted into silver coins. Basically, if you had $1, that would be $1 worth of silver. That executive order didn't stand, though, because he was assassinated in November. What other event happened right before Nesara was about to be enacted? Oh, that was 9/11. Right.
Nesara. I know I left you on a cliffhanger and I apologize. But we're actually going to work backwards because we have to look at where Nesara came from and where the Federal Reserve came from. Have you ever heard of the Bankers Manifesto? You're about to, and you're not going to believe it. In 1892, bankers adopted the Bankers Manifesto. We, the bankers, must proceed with caution and guard every move made, for the lower order of people are already showing signs of restless commotion. The courts must be called to aid, debts must be collected, bonds and mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. Basically, it's a banker's way in how to control the people. Talks about through the process of law, the common people will have their homes taken from them, easily governed through the influence of strong-arm government. Anyone that's not with them is of the lower order of people. The people must be kept in a state of political antagonism. Charles A. Lindbergh heard of this and revealed it sometime during his term. A small group of powerful bankers have a secret Nesara. Picking right back up where he left off. A small group of big bankers had a secret meeting and created what we know as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act basically allows the Federal Reserve to print our money. Instead of thin air, just here's more money. Anyone knows about economics, that's not smart. There's only so much set amount of gold and precious metals in the world, including silver too. The Federal Reserve is literally taking all of our precious metals and printing out money for it. Saying, here you go, this represents XYZ, how much ever money it represents. The thing is they can kind of change the value of that money based on how much they print. And the Federal Reserve isn't even a part of the government. It's not owned by anyone. They are accountable to nobody. Now our money is backed by the dollar. Dollar is the credit of the nation. Federal Reserve owns the credit line. Stay tuned for part 4. If the Federal Reserve is so bad, why is everybody on board with it? This is what they say. Second, they want to provide the nation with a safer, more flexible, more stable monetary financial system. Safer because we can control your money. Remember this Bankers Manifesto? Back and look at the language used. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. The President of the United States has the power to oversee trade between the United States and any enemies of war. In 1933, there was an amendment to this. The United States citizens are no longer any different from any enemy of the United States. And if you cross-reference that with the Bankers Manifesto, it's very similar language. Go ahead. In 1934, they made another change. Now, the ultimate ownership of all property is in the state. Individuals can so-called own it, but it's only by virtue of the government. If you're not using it the way that they want you to, then they can take it. And then in the 1970s, there was a huge foreclosure on farmer mortgage. The last one in the caption said part 5. I'm sorry. We talked about in the 1970s where the Federal Land Bank was foreclosing on people's properties illegally. We did have great years in the farming industry around the early 70s, 72 to 75. Due to unforeseen weather conditions around the world, led to the U.S. skyrocketing in exports of agriculture. The people were happy, the farmers were millionaires on paper. So we were producing so much food and trying to feed the world, because everyone else had a drought. We signed a multi-year contract with the Soviet Union for wheat and grains in 1972. In 1973, the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, has been quoted demanding farmers to plant fence row to fence row. He told them to get big or get out. And they did. They also went into debt doing so. They took out loans on their properties to get bigger. They took out loans for bigger equipment. Obviously, more seed. Producing record crops, but prices bottomed out in Gesara. And we're about to meet one of the key players. If you're looking for context, go back and watch parts 1 through 5. Now that you know a little bit of the history, let's go to 1978.
In 1978, an elderly farmer purchased a farm, the loan from the Federal Land Bank. After he died, he passed it on to Roy Swishinger Jr., key player. It's important to know he was a retired military general. After getting the land, he was greeted on his land by two people, a federal marshal and a Federal Land Bank officer, telling him that they were foreclosing on his farm and gave him 30 days to vacate. Without his knowledge, his father had a stipulation in his loan. In the event of the borrower's death, the property is reverted back to the Federal Land Bank. Take a second to read and we're moving on. So Swishinger filed a class action lawsuit in the Denver federal court, and it was dismissed on a basis of incorrect filing. Seems eerily familiar. And this prompts Roy to investigate the inner workings of the banking system. I'm going to fast forward to Nesara. I'm doing sign language. In 1982, Roy Swishinger was given a contract by the U.S. Senate and Supreme Court to investigate the banking fraud. But he was on a strict non-disclosure order. Couldn't tell the media anything. As information goes, he starts telling people, his close friends, who then helped him bring another class action lawsuit against the federal government. The lawsuits, though, first started with William and Shirley Bakersville, hired a lawyer to help with the foreclosure of their restaurant. And then all of a sudden, the lawyer dropped them. Roy heard about this and offered to help them because he had been through it too. He offered direct advice on exactly how to file it. And in 1987, they filed an appeal. Here's where it gets interesting. In 1988, Denver federal court ruled that indeed the banks had defrauded the Bakervilles and proceeded with its reverse bankruptcy decision. The property was never returned. Eventually, people started to get together because it happened to them too. Let's move on to part. I've been talking about the illegal foreclosures. We never discussed how. So because we are not on the gold standard, banks were able to charge exorbitant interest rates. They were also not crediting people's accounts. It wouldn't go to their mortgage, it would go to something else. Sometimes even into their own pocket. When there was no payment made on the account, it triggered foreclosure. Roy continued his fight, but they ran out of money. Then he got the assistance of the Farmers Union. He filed a new lawsuit against the Federal Land Bank and the Farmers Credit System. You want to look up the case number, here it is. And again, the district court ruled and ordered in favor of the banks to return the stolen properties with the help of the federal marshals or National Guard. But no payments were made. The farmers then filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy against the Federal Land Bank and the Farmers Credit System. The banks appealed their case, insisting that they were a federal agency and not liable to pay any damages. What? So now Roy and his team have to go back. They have to think about how to come at this in a new way. 9. Wasting no time. Farmers' legal team had to think of a new strategy, a new way to come at this, to get the Federal Land Bank to repay it and re-get back their land. They went back to the Federal Land Bank's charter in 1933. It stated they were not allowed to make loans directly to applicants, but instead can only back them. Because the Land Bank violated this rule, the farmers were able to successfully sue the bank for damages. And then everyone figured out that they were able to have a lawsuit as well. And there was a legal team ready and willing to teach them how to file, to know how to win. Because the banks had defrauded them. Anyone remember Willie Nelson's Farm Aid concerts? The Baskerville case had now become the Farmer Claims class action lawsuit. Banks start to get worried. They start charging outrageous fees, imprisoning the people's legal teams under frivolous reasons. Farmers then realized they were being targeted and unfairly treated. Had to have people like Roy come in the courtroom to make sure that the judges weren't bribed, would vote to constitutional law. Let's go on to part 10. Turns out the National Banking Act requires it to register their charters with the Federal State Bureau of Records. None of these banks complied, which allowed the legal team to sue the Farmers Credit System. However, this lawsuit kept on getting thrown out of court at each level. Not only was the lawsuit being thrown out, the records of them were being purposely destroyed. One example of the court case. Dismissed on grounds of complaint filed a state claim. Judges were immune. Defendants not properly served. And then the plaintiff's actions was dismissed after they failed to submit a timely amended complaint. Word jumble and secret stipulations. But Roy wasn't done. He brought this case before the United States Supreme Court. The content was sealed, but you can view most of it today. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Farmers Union claims were indeed valid. All property foreclosed on by the Farmers Credit Union was illegal, and all those who were foreclosed on would have to receive damages. In addition to this, they found the Federal Reserve was unlawful.
I have no more fingers. The Supreme Court ruled that the Federal Reserve was unlawful. Because there's a little bit of controversy. The Federal Reserve is privately owned. There are some people that will argue with you that they're not. The Federal Reserves were supposed to be the lenders of last resort. Check back to the Panic of 1907. I'm not going to go into it, but it basically inspired the creation to the Federal Reserve. They wanted to be a backing system for the banks. in case they were to go under. So these are some excerpts from court cases where time and time again it was proven and the precedent was set that the Federal Reserve was privately owned and not liable for the claims that these people were making. And if you look deep enough, the Federal Reserve is 100% owned by shareholders, and the shareholders are private banks. So how does the Federal Reserve make money? Something called open market operations. We'll go over that in detail in part 12. So and it'll make you, does the Federal Reserve make money? Because they don't get any kind of appropriations from Congress. So if our government is low on money, they go to the Treasury. The Treasury issues bonds. Bonds are debt. The bond dealers then auction them off. Now, if the feds want to increase the money supply, they then go out and buy the bonds from the bonds dealers. With what money, though? Numbers that they input onto a spreadsheet. The bonds that the Federal Reserve buys then become the reserves that the banking establishment uses to back the loans. Loans to us. And the more that they do this, the more interest they're going to charge on us. If you want to know more about that, look into fractional reserve lending. I want to get off on too many branches here. And everyone keeps on talking about the income tax. The income tax amendment was only ratified by 4 states. Therefore, it wasn't a legal amendment. The court ruled the government illegally foreclosed on the farmer's home with the help of federal agents. Everything must be given back.
The money was never real.
So the Supreme Court ruled that the Federal Reserve was unlawful due to the many reasons in the last video. And they were ordered to pay back everything. Land, all the precious metals they stole, and pay back damages. Not just for 1 or 2, but for hundreds of cases. It would literally bankrupt the Federal Reserve, which was the monetary system of the United States. Which was created so that the monetary system of the United States wouldn't fail. So the government then sought legal assistance from a group of small benevolent visionaries, politicians, military guards, business people. And these people were getting together since the 50s to help restore a constitution. Now, here's a little bit of conspiracy. Somehow, a U.S. Army general received the title. He was the receiver of the original 1933 United States bankruptcy. Supreme Court then ruled in favor of letting him keep the title over the United States. Legal action was then passed on, and guess who they were working with? Roy. They start planning what we know as Nesara.
Part 4 kind of stuff, really interests me. Stuff has happened in our history that you would think only happens in movies. I know I said I would have a part 14 out yesterday, but real life happened yesterday and I couldn't get to it. I try to put a lot of time and research into it. I don't want to just feed you bad information. That's not what I want to do. I'm sharing it because it's interesting and you need to know your history. But as I was looking back, I realized I never really went into the gold seizures, how the government actually illegally took the gold and the precious metals from the people. So I guess this will be a 13.5. If you go back and look at part 4, we talk about the Trading with the Enemy Act. There was an executive order made under this act. Executive Order 6102. Just take a second. It basically forbids any person from having gold. You would turn all your gold over to the government and they would give you a price per ounce of their money. But
Gesara updates. While doing research for my part 14 video, I came up on this. It's a website giving daily updates on what is going on with Nesara and Gesara. But the thing is it keeps kicking me off every single time I get to the page. Just watch. And once it kicks me off, it won't let me go back. I have to completely exit out every single time. What's weird to me though is I'm using DuckDuckGo. I'm not using Google. So why is a Google notification coming up? But I did screenshot it and I will be going over the news articles. And for those just waiting for that alert, I heard it was coming today or tomorrow, but I'll do a different video on that one. Nesara, part 14. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the farmers' class action lawsuit. They found that indeed they were defrauded. So if you go back to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, all present and succeeding debts against the U.S. Treasury must be assumed by the Federal Reserve. So they used that executive order to force the Federal Reserve to pay out their money in gold-backed currency. This article states that there is an obscure attachment to the 14th Amendment. This is what's been holding me up, guys. I can't find it anywhere. But after the Civil War, the government allowed citizens to make a claim for payment for anyone who suffered damages as a result of the federal government failing to protect its citizens by a foreign government. And that foreign government is the federal government. So the Organic Act of 1871, I didn't go over it, but it allows the District of Columbia to operate on its own, under its own constitution. And if you remember the Trading with the Enemies Act, every citizen is defined as an enemy. So Roy and his legal team made some additional adjustments to their settlement. We will go over that in part
Number 16 of laws that the government does not want you to know. The U.S. Constitution does not give us any rights. Maritime Admiralty Law is the law that supersedes civil law, but this law only applies to you if you are contracted into it. In 1933, the United States government filed bankruptcy and they began taking loans from the Federal Reserve. In order to get these loans, they had to put something up for collateral as a payment. And that payment is you. Having a birth certificate lowers your natural rights and reclassifies you as a corporation. Check your birth certificate and any form of identification. If it is in all capital letters, they are referring to you as the corporation and not yourself as being the human. Being the corporation identifies you as an artificial person, but your human innate abilities is that of a natural person. Like and follow if I should make a part 2.
Part 15. Roy and the legal team made stipulations to their settlement. Here it is. They needed to be paid in a lawful currency, backed by gold or silver. Second, they would be required to go back to common law instead of admiral law. That is a whole nother beast that we will cover in another video. Lastly, IRS dismantled, because it was actually just a trust. And this is the basis of the Nesara law. When they finally settled on a number, per claim, 336,000 claims. And if you're doing the math, that's $6.6 trillion. Go ahead and read. We're going to talk about it. I can't go over the validity, though, because there's literally nothing on it. So they did a good job. But as the story goes, the Supreme Court heard about this. They placed a gag order on the case, struck all information from the Federal Registry, placed all the records in the Supreme Court files. There was an undisclosed settlement out of court. No one was allowed to share to the media. It would violate the settlement. Part 16. If you've been following along with my series, the Supreme Court has struck all files and settled for a non-disclosed amount outside of court, with gag orders that no one could say anything, and all the files were destroyed. However, Roy knew that the problem wasn't fixed. So in 1991, he went before a Senate committee. And if you don't know what a Senate committee is, monitor ongoing government operations, evaluate the information, and recommend course of action. He presented to the court evidence that the corporation of the United States was indeed tied to New World Order. Roll the clip.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
Later in 1992, a task force was put together. 300 retired U.S. military officers. These men were vetted to make sure that they held constitutional values prior to the task force being put together. They were tasked with investigating everything. Government officials, congressional officers, judges, and the Federal Reserve. 3 of these men include Admiral Jeremy Borda, died in 1996. General David McLeod. He died in 1998. And the former Director of Central Intelligence, William Kobe, died in 1996. These men, along with others in their task force, uncovered common acts of bribery and extortion. They found that the criminal activity was so rampant, only 2 out of 535 members of Congress were deemed trustworthy. They found this out. They threatened to raid their offices at military gunpoint. They complied. You'll never believe what they found. Part 18. Here we go. With the military threatening to raid the offices, the Federal Reserve allowed the audit. And after reviewing, they found $800 trillion sitting into accounts that should have been applied to the national debt. Contrary to the propaganda, most nations, in fact, owed money to the United States instead of the other way around. As the article says, these trillions of dollars were confiscated and placed in a European bank account. The idea was they were going to pay off the debt for the lawsuit that they owed all these farmers. But none of this stopped George Bush, Daddy Bush. Because as you may or may not know, he was in bed with some bad people. Hell, he was a bad person. Fast forward a few more months in August of 1992. Bush was confronted by military officers. They demanded that he sign an agreement to return the United States to constitutional law. He pretended to comply, but had other plans of his own. Late 1992 and 1993, just before he left office,
he starts signing some executive orders. Like I said, at the end of Daddy Bush's term, he starts signing some executive orders. These executive orders actually take away powers, regulate payment of, and lessen the authority of contracted government employees. Could he be targeting the government contracted employees that found out what he was doing? Let's look at Public Law 102378 that was signed on October 2nd, 1992. The Office of Personnel shall prescribe regulations necessary, criteria governing the circumstances in which it is appropriate to employ an expert or consultant, numbered how many days they could be employed. He also signed Executive Order 12829, which established the National Industrial Security Program. Let's take a look. Establishes the standard procedures and requirements for all government contractors. Safeguards the federal government classified information that is released to the contractor.
But Nesara was supposed to be announced, like I said in part 1, on 9/11, just an hour before the planes hit. Now, after 9/11 happened, there was no way they were going to completely disrupt the Federal Reserve and completely change our monetary system. It would have been utter chaos, which was their plan. Make it to where Nesara couldn't be announced. Like I said in previous videos, Trump signed Nesara in November of 2020. It was signed originally by Clinton in 1993, but wasn't scheduled to be announced until 2001. I'm guessing it took them that long to work out the details. So I'm not sure if there's going to be a waiting period or we have to see if Trump gets in office. I don't know. But I can pretty much guarantee that if Biden gets in the office, we'll never hear about Nesara again.
Remember when we were talking about the Insurrection Act being signed?
Section 1 of the 20th Amendment in the Constitution says, the terms of the President and Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th of January.
Did anyone see when Biden was sworn in? Joe Biden was sworn in at 11:46. Technically, Trump is president until noon. And get this, any live feed that would have a time out in the bottom left-hand corner, they've all been blocked out. I did, however, do my research and found it was 11:46 based on my personal clock and how far I had to go back in the live stream. And if you really want to know, you can go ahead and do that yourself. People who have followed along my Nesara series will remember the Organic Act of 1871 established a 10 by 10 radius for the District of Columbia. They also operate under their own constitution. Theory. D.C. could be an enemy of the state. And the inauguration happened in D.C. on foreign soil that's an enemy of the state. Make the inauguration null and void.